like I said, I'm globally responsible for knowledge management in a large organization. And I want to share a little bit on where we are on our journey and how we think we go forward, and the aspiration that was set around how we can achieve $1 billion in value from KM, which is one of the big goals that we're trying to achieve. Before I start the presentation, there's always a cautionary note I have to give by our legal department, so if you all carefully read this and I'll question you afterwards. Now, just basically it says, based on my presentation, don't decide to buy or not to buy shares in our company. It's just a legal constraint. If you're worried about it, leave the room now. Are we all good to go? Good. During the session, I'll do 2 or 3 polls, so you can use your mobile phone during the session. So this means don't do your Facebook and whatever. If it's really boring, you can do that. But I also will have a few polls that I would like to get some of your views on the matters I'm presenting. Are we good to go? So the 3 things I want to cover is a little bit our journey on knowledge management. Where did we came from? My predecessor, who was responsible for this, was in KM World in 2014, presenting a bit of our plans that we were about to go on to. I don't know if some of you saw that presentation, but I'll pick up from there. And he shared a little bit of the plans that we had. I want to now share where we got to. And I think we're starting to explore what the next steps might look like to really get to our aspiration. So I'll talk about the journey. I'll talk about the 350 million that we achieved so far. Actually, I got the latest number this morning, and it's about 403 million. So I'm well on the way to achieve my target. And how we plan to go forward from there. Where is the value going to come from? Because maybe a question before I start, how many of you believe that you work in KM, that you have way more value to offer, but those business people don't want to listen to you? So that's a lot of things that I've experienced being in this role for 3 years, is how do I talk to a business leader? How do I make it interesting for them? Because I don't know if you get it, you know the concept of an elevator pitch? Which you go in the elevator with a senior person and you talk to them. If I talk to our CEO or to some of the C-suite people, and you talk about knowledge management, you see their eyes glaze over and they take up the phone saying they have an important other thing to do. So I try and change a little bit my language and how I talk about the value for the company, and that's what I want to share a little bit my lessons learned from that. Because that's how I talk about value. I start to use the word knowledge management less and less, if you will. So maybe to start with our journey. We started with a company where pre-program, as we call it, before 2013, we had a lot of great initiatives in the company. There were all kind of pockets of excellence. I don't know any organization who recognizes that, where you see that people are doing, experimenting with new tools, new technologies, new approaches, new ideas. We had a lot of that scattered around the organization. And that was okay, but it didn't give the scale up and the real benefits that we were looking for as an organization. So there was a program formed in about 2013 to really say, let's bring all of that together to one standard way of doing it, and let's see if we can achieve some scale through rolling that out consistently across our organization. And we did that in 3 waves. And what you see here is we focused very much on the technical areas. We're a very technical company, and we think big decisions that we want to influence are technical decisions or commercial decisions. So we really started in that area. Plus, it's a bit organized. Plus, we're dealing with engineers. We thought we could know how to do that. So it was an interesting part of starting that journey. We're about to finish the 3rd wave, because we did it in 3 waves. And as you can see, it takes quite some time. It took us typically 12 to 18 months to roll that out. Because I think, in my view, most of what we focused on, see it as a change program rather than a KM program. We focused really on how do we make it relevant for the business. See it as a change program. How do we get the leaders excited? How do we get the employees excited? How do we get especially the middle management excited, which is often what we find a more difficult group to get onto our journey. And we learned how to do that on the way as well. And that's where we got to. So by the end of 2018, we should have completed the final 3. So fingers crossed, we're well on track to do that by the end of this year. And then we're starting to say, what is our next step of the journey? So I want to share.
Did the technology chunk tie in with organizational?
Good question. It actually went across, and that was one of the reasons for choosing it as well, because we saw that organizations change much more rapidly, and these groups of technologies are more stable across our organization. And that was a reason for picking these areas as well. So like I said, I want to share a little bit of how much value we've delivered so far and what our plans are about, because this was a big program, and I was running a big program, and basically you can have about 5 years to run a program, and then the organization says, what's next? So the key thing is about how do we move from a programmatic view to a much more embedded way of doing this as part of our organization. And I want to share a little bit of that as well. And this is basically the key slide that I want to share with you, which is about telling the KM story. And this is how I tell the KM story in our organization. Because when we started in our organization, we had a lot of KM cool tools. I don't know how many of you, when you talk about KM, you talk about all the elements and the tools and the process you have. Who starts with that, or who has, many times the conversations are about those type of things. And then there's a big gap between the CEOs and the business leaders I work with who are focused on what is our problem we're trying to solve, what is our strategy, where do we want to go as an organization. So I needed to find a way to connect all the cool things that we have to make them relevant for the people at the top. And that was what I focused on when I started in this job. And one of the things we used is a simple model, and I'll dive into that because that's the crux of the value and where the value comes from. A model based on H.N. Wenger, who did some work on the value of communities. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but we reused that a bit or changed that a bit to make it fit our story around KM. And I'll share some examples of these because that's the focus areas of where we make KM relevant and we connect it to other parts of the organization. It's not a standalone piece of thing. It's something that's the way we do business in our company. That's what we're trying to do. Then we talk about 4 purpose areas, because I also want to say, what do you do in KM? And then you get a whole list of, oh, we have this tool and we have this. So how can I simply say in a couple of words what we're about in order to achieve the value that we want to achieve? And we basically said, it's 4 things. We connect people to people. We connect people to validated content, some information they can trust. We drive collaboration across the organization, and we capture and share lessons. Those are the 4 things we do. And I found people start to remember that after I tell them a number of times. Better than if I try and explain all the elements and tools and processes that we use. And also we see that this is relatively consistent. This we try and be much more flexible and adaptable and change over time. But the crux for me is about the value. So that's what I want to zoom into, especially in this conversation. So, and I know this is a bit of a busy slide, but we use a bit of an infographic to share where we are in our story. So here you can see the leading areas. So you see the 4 areas that I talked about. And we track a lot of stuff, which we call leading indicators. Things that we know sort of the system seems to be working. People are filling in their profiles. People are connecting with other people. People are looking for information. Articles are being created. Things are happening across the globe. We see the things happening. And then you say, how does that turn up in value? So like I said, this is the state of August 2018. We are a bit above that, but we capture it in what we call success stories. I have a library of about probably 280 stories. And each of the stories is an example of how KM adds value. And I'll share a few of the stories as part of my presentation. And we've seen that these stories are important for 2 reasons. One is, in the end, if you want to sustain a long journey like KM, you need to talk about value. Because some of the ways, there's a few business leaders who get it, but there's quite a few who need to see the results. And you probably have a mix of those across your board, the people that you're dealing with. So I need to show value. And the numbers they put on the success stories are the numbers they claim they save from it. It's not my claim. So we ask them to validate what it is. And I'll share some examples of the type of stories and how that's calculated, because some of that might be helpful in your journeys as well. And the second thing we do, the stories are actually the culture we want to build. Because if you talk about culture, and you can talk about can you create a culture or not, there's a whole debate. But culture, for me, is a lot about the stories we tell each other. So we use the stories as well as a way of influencing the way we talk about the accepted and the desired ways of working in our company. So, given that, I'll dive into the model a bit, and then I'll ask you to do a big poll to say which of these areas is most relevant in your company. So I'll soon explain how we do the poll, but I want to know a little bit in the room where you think most of the value of the programs you're doing is coming from. Is that okay? So I'll say and I'll explain how to do that, but let me go into the model a bit, because that was the essential part for me to bridge the gaps between our overall strategy and the KM solution. So basically, it's a simple model talking about short-term value, long-term value. I get that. And value from an individual perspective or value from an organization perspective or community perspective, if you will. This is the crux of what I found relevant to have business conversations. Because what you see here are these words are the words that my business cares about when I talk to my business leaders. So let me walk you through each of the 4 quadrants, then I'll do a poll and then I'll go and share some examples. So performance support. This is really about an engineer or a person sitting in an asset, somewhere having a problem. How can they find a solution? Can they find a best practice? Connecting to share lessons. Can they find an expert? Connecting people to people. Can they find what the standard is? Connecting people to can they reach out to a community? Drive collaboration. That's when I talk about productivity improvements. I don't talk about KM connecting people. I talk about what it means for our business. The second one that we are exploring is increased engagement. Most of our value comes from currently the productivity improvement, but we're looking at increased engagement because there's a lot of literature around communities help to get engagement numbers up. So we're trying to see how we can explore that further. So that's a new area for us. We started very much on that, enabling the front line, enabling people to reach out to colleagues and find out other information. That's really where most of our starting value comes from. Second one, if you go to the longer term, is more like learning and development. Because this is about not probably learning what you need now, but learning something, learning a skill, getting access to information that you might need at some other point. And we have a lot of things here on rapid onboarding. I don't know who of you have onboarding programs running in your company? Probably every. And how many of these are really focused on the content and shove as much binders to, the first onboarding I did was here's all the binders and here's all the information and good luck. Well, research shows that most of the onboarding to make it rich is about connecting people together. So we're trying to influence the onboarding program by connecting the right people together. You're welcome to the company. Here's all the binders of what you should and shouldn't do. You're also welcome to this company. And here are some of the people you'll be working with. And here are your colleagues across the globe that are all connecting. So it's also about, and we've seen some great success stories on really shortening the time to autonomy, as we call it. And that's what business leaders care about. How do I get my organization as productive as quickly as possible? And that's why we see how we can do that. 70-20-10 is a model. There was another model used this morning. In the learning world, they use the model 70-20-10 as a way of talking about learning. 70% learn on the job, 20% from others, 10% formal learning. And we try and see how we can help with that, especially on the job, because you have all the materials available. 20% connecting people to people. Is there coaches and mentors you can find? And then the 10% is the formal learning. How can we digitize learning? Because there's a lot of boring stuff. And then I'll share an example of what we've done in that space as well. That's learning and development. The other area that I find a lot of business leaders talk about more from an organization perspective is operational excellence. Some organizations call it continuous improvement. There's many words you use for it. But I simply describe it as 4 boxes. What is required to do operational excellence? I think the first thing is you have to define what good looks like. Many people are saying we have to be excellent, but have you defined what good looks like? And we do that by saying, make it easy, write down, have a talk, explain what good looks like. The second piece I talk about is teach people what good looks like. Don't assume that because they have seen it, they actually know how to do it. And then we have a few tools to do that. Then you actually support people implementing what good looks like. What if they have a question? Where can they go? We connect people to the experts. And then the last thing we do is make sure that while people are implementing, learn from them, so you get the best practices, and then you can improve again what good looks like. And that's the cycle we try and improve in that area. And I'll share an example of how we've done that in one of our businesses. And that's a very valuable piece of where we got a lot of success stories from as well, especially in an organization like ours, which is across the globe, many different challenges that we face over and over again. So that's a big area. And the final area, which we call winning capability, and that's really, if you will, if you want to be a learning organization, if you want to be an organization that learns faster than its competitors, some of our strategies say that's probably ultimately the only competitive advantage you might have, you need to build real foundational capability in areas that you really want to be good at. And we've defined about 5 areas we want to be good at, and my focus in KM is on those 5 areas. Because we don't want to only have competent people, we want to have a competent organization. We want the processes, the systems, the tools, everything to really build an intrinsic winning capability. And I can share an example of that as well. Do we get a little bit of these models? Does it resonate? Do you see elements of this? Are we ready for a quick poll? Yeah, so if you Google it, you will find it, but 70% is learning from the job you're doing. So most of you learn is by doing a job. 20% is learning from others, coaching, mentoring, job shadowing, whatever. 10% is formal learning. So let me open the poll and see if it works. Please take your mobile phone or your laptop, go to menti.com, type in the code, and you will be asked a question around where you think the value is coming from in your area, for the 4 areas that are presented. So while you do that, I'll launch the thing so we can see the results. So the number will still be visible. Just a second. For some reason, it's not showing. Are you voting? One more second. Somehow, I'm trying to show the results, but it's not showing on mine. Yeah, you have to divvy up 100 points. So I'll probably close it shortly. So I can see a real mix of people talking about operational excellence, learning and development, performance support, winning capabilities. So interesting to hear a little bit about what is behind these. Let me explain. Now I'll stop the poll, and I'll go and close voting. And I'll continue my story. So let me start on the performance support side, because that's on the top left if you know the 4 quadrants. Try and visualize that picture, because I'm going to run through a few examples that we've seen in our company to illustrate this with real stories, and then see if they resonate with you as well. So this is sort of a way, if you look at, I talked about how we brand KM and we talk about KM. As you can see, practically I talk about powered by knowledge management. I don't talk about knowledge management itself. I talk about a person, and this is the person of a real case study where someone needed a technical piece of equipment and didn't know where to get it or how to use it, and he reached out to the community and got really good support to get one of the supports. So this is an example of people in the center, a real business problem we're trying to solve, powered by KM. So it's almost like you use laptop as Intel Inside, and you have some of these as well where it's really about we're an enabler to achieve something bigger. And we see a lot of these questions, because typically what we get is people in the front line, they want to reach out. They have a problem, they want to find best practice, they want to find the expert, they want to find someone in the community, have you done this before? And I think another example is, one of the ways is here is an example of a case study, or an example where someone had a real problem. One thing for me is, when you told my background, I'm not a technical background, so I find always if the question is really technical and I don't understand it, it's a good question. Because it's not a simple question, it's a real technical people talking to technical people about real problems they have. And this is one of those. So I didn't even know exactly what was going on, but this was a question by someone posed in New Zealand, and they got responses from Qatar, Australia, Malaysia, and that helped them to make a saving of ultimately about $800,000. And we have many of these examples across the globe of connecting people. It's one of the ways of, it's very easy, and if you look at how do we calculate the results, because how do we practically know that? So the simplest savings we do is time saving. Hey, a great idea, it saves me 2 weeks of work, because I don't have to do the same study you did some time ago. That's the simplest. And you know what a person costs, so they calculate saving X. The second one is more like, hey, you save me from having to buy a piece of equipment, or you save me from doing something and having to buy something because you have a clever solution. Which just gets more, and that gets quite big in our industry because some of these things are quite expensive. And the third one, which we have a few as well, the biggest value cases are, I didn't have to stop producing, or I didn't have to stop the business I'm doing. Because that, I guess, if you talk about business leaders, is one of the biggest problems they have if they have to stop their production because they can't solve a problem. That's sort of where I would probably say 60 or 70, 60% from our 400 million comes from these type of stories. And of course, we in the background can monitor that because I have people in my team who monitor these communities, and when we see there's a big potential, we investigate a bit and we draft a success story. So it's a very practical way of make sure that you make that visible. And ideally, share that success story back in your community so they know what you're looking for and you start creating that culture. So we really use the success story as a vehicle of propelling our change.
So you calculate, your team calculates?
Now, most of the time the business calculates it, and then I'm quite conservative in these numbers, so because I did some finance before that, I actually take it down a notch because sometimes they claim the world and I want to remain realistic. And the key thing is, if I share this to a business leader, they get it because most of them are financially savvy, so they know these numbers. If it's 2 weeks of work, it costs me X miles because I know what it means to hire someone for 2 weeks. So as long as it's realistic numbers, and we have a few ways of validating that, and we have a few premises that we use consistently, and it's the same numbers that continuous improvement uses. So we have a bit of a common methodology across our organization. So again, it's a bit of credibility. So that helps in terms of making these numbers. Second one, if you go to learning and development. I don't know how many of you have great e-learnings in your company? How many have not so great e-learnings in your company? What we've seen is a lot, or learning programs that are long or dreadful or whatever. We try to say, how can we get more nuggetized, smaller building blocks of learning? And you say, what does that have to do with KM? Well, we found the critical thing is, one is to make them smaller, but the other thing is to make them easy to find. So that people, when they have a question and they type in our corporate search engine a topic, they find the nuggets, the valuable nuggets that are created by our experts. And it's a little bit the idea of the Khan Academy. I don't know if you're familiar with that, which is Salman Khan, great TED talk, by the way, about how he creates that. But we tried to mimic that. And we saw actually our platform was a real springboard to do that because we had all the taxonomies and all the structuring behind it. We just had a bit of a bad look and feel, so we created a little bit of a nicer look and feel. It's mobile accessible and it's huge uptake. And it actually digitized our learning. So some of my success stories are courses that you used to run for 2 weeks and now can be done in 3 or 4 days, focused on practice, and the rest of the content can be done outside of the courses. So it's again an example of where we connected with learning and development and really saw some opportunities to do that as well. If I go to operational excellence, so that's if you look at the 4 boxes again, the bottom left, so organizational short term. This is our executive vice president retail. So people, if you fuel up at a station, he's accountable for all the stations across the world, about 40,000. And he was worried about 40,000 assets, and they're not all performing in the same way. Some are high performing, some are average. So there must be a trick. Some of it is locally determined, but if you know as an organization how to do high performance, but we don't do it consistently across, there's a gap. There's a potential value gap that we can close. So we hooked up with them and said, how can we do practice sharing across those retail sites? So we came up with a very practical process of how to do that. But of course, the technology is simple. The key thing is he was a champion. He championed it. He made his leadership team accountable for these things. He had an award ceremony where the biggest replications get awarded. So he drove with us the change journey of making that happen. So again, we saw it as a business opportunity because he saw mixing sort of results in terms of retail sites. And we closed the gap by helping to share the practices because somewhere in the company we knew how to do it. We just didn't do it consistently across. And that was a real good example of replicating successes across the organization. And it's a very simple process in a way. It just means for us, I mean, maybe a personal learning for me is we're a company of engineers. They're proud of inventing new stuff. And for us, the challenge is really getting them to say, it's not about inventing new stuff, it's really getting ultimately the outcomes that we want and be creative in how you get to the outcomes, not creative of yet coming up with a new solution. That's the cultural change that we're trying to make. I don't know, some companies might have different types of audiences and might be slightly different, but that's part of the challenge that we're trying to overcome. And that's why we need to put all these change efforts in order to make that happen. And I think one of the biggest things for me in the journey in order to get from 400 million to $1 billion is tied even closer to performance and outcomes. To see where performance is different and help and use the creativity of the communities and the people to go after that value. That's what we're trying to do. So another example, so example from retail. So a best practice that came up in one location, and then it was immediately replicated across the world. And again, if you want practically, how do you calculate the value? Well, you know sort of what the benefit was the first time. You know how often you replicated it, so you can easily calculate what the value is in terms of the replication value. So a very practical way, again, of creating success stories that will help to propel you going forward. And in this case, like we have many success stories that even are difficult to quantify. So I'm not in an industry of trying to quantify everything, because that's just, then you have cottage industries of people who can do that for you. You can hire consultants, you can do whatever you want. We're trying to get to the easy quantifiable ones, and the other ones we just mentioned, the important ones. So here, if it says 90-day saving, someone in the business will know that it's a lot of money. So we're capturing the intangible benefits that a lot of times are attributed to KM, we try and capture as well. We just capture them as success stories, but we don't quantify them. So I think that's a different way of doing it, but it still becomes part of sort of our library of success stories. That make sense? And this one was a good example. In retail, I think we've saved about, of the 400 million, maybe about 100 million came from retail, from replicating practices. I think this is my last example. This is one of our business leaders in the commercial area. He's a sort of a commercial deal maker or the head of that. And he talks about really how knowledge drives business. And one of the examples I learned from him, what he talks about, who here knows about after action reviews? Who's doing them or who's facilitating or organizing them? How many of you do before action reviews? I mean, what he says is we in knowledge management, our focus in often case was on capturing the lessons. We do a lot of knowledge capturing, root cause analysis, all that kind of stuff. But when do we do before action review? Before we start a new project, let's find out who's done it before, where we have the experts in the company, etc. How structurally do we do before action reviews when we make, in his case, new deals? So his key driver is, if someone comes with a new idea, he first says, who have you talked to already? Where have we tried this before? Where is this best practices already available? So the whole practice of before action reviews is something that we're trying to pick up as well, because we think that might be a way of helping to do the language structure. Because you can see here the language working out loud. Who of you uses that sort of methodology or language in your company? A few. We find it works, but it doesn't resonate as much. I find is if I use before action review, everybody gets it because they know an after action review, so I piggyback on that word. And that's why John does that as well. So it's again another leader who is clear about what he wants to achieve and helps us to do it, and we partner with him to do that. And maybe that's a broad lesson I've learned. When we implement KM, the waves I showed you, we tied those waves closely to business change agendas. So as much as possible, I don't want to drive a separate KM program. I want to drive KM as part of an operational excellence program, or drive KM as part of a replication program. So we piggybacked or connected our program to that. There's a pros to that because we get a lot of scope, we get a lot of benefits. The disadvantage is that sometimes you don't get everything you want, what you say what good KM would look like. So we have a blueprint, like I showed you in the beginning, on the end, what we think good KM would look like, with all these bells and whistles and everything connected. But we realize that to get there, we shouldn't push just the blueprint. We should find ways of getting to that blueprint. So we know we're not making stupid decisions, but we don't necessarily do everything for everyone all the time. We've done it for some of the technical areas to build the foundations. Now we want to see how we build on that. The last one, which I'm keen on because, as you know, the world of energy, quite some negative effects with energy, fossil, etc. And how do we do that? One of the things I'm proud of is that we're starting to work with the new energies business as well to see how can we accelerate the transformation to new energies. And we did some practical work around understanding how you be successful in that world. We captured the lessons and we start now to draw some principles from that and start to see if we can replicate that as well. So It's one of the areas. Sometimes you pick the ones that the business is important. I also find sometimes I pick the areas I want to work in. Don't quote me on that, anybody, but I think if there's passion and energy behind it, I think that would be good. Second question, the last one, because I want to cover one more topic, is I think you should, if you open now, you get a different question. Can someone validate that? You get a different question? No? Yes?
That's not open.
Do I get to open it? So the second question is about how do we take the next step of the journey? So like I said, we've done quite a bit of work on this journey so far. The question is how do we go forward? And like I said, we have to go from a programmatic approach to a more embedded approach. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay. So the question is really around where do you put KM if you embed it in the organization? Because like I shared the value model, there's different areas of value coming from different functional areas in your company. So I'm interested just to see where your organization is at and where you're based. So let me see if I can. It's just slow. Somehow. Yeah. Yeah, it's. I think my laptop is not playing up with me. Let me ask the question in the room because I don't think it's working. Who is based in IT? Who's based in projects or special projects or corporate strategy or any of those? Who's based in HR? Talent HR, yeah, talent learning. Any others?
Within support.
Support? Finance? Good. Cool. Okay, it's a bit of so probably quite mixed. And do you see that depending on which organization you're part of, it drives different types of what people are looking for and the way it drives your programs and the way where your value might come from? Because that's what we've seen. I mean, I'm part of the HR organization. It used to be the learning organization, but we've now built an organization called Organizational Capability, which is really about how do you build structural organizational capabilities in the organization. And I want to share a little bit, sort of the last slide I want to use is about what that looks like. But I've seen the more people I talk to, it really drives different things. So when I was part of learning, we focused very much on the change element of KM and the change management and the people side of things. I've seen sometimes I talk to an organization when you're IT, you focus on the tools and the solutions. And so a little bit of, for me to think about the next step of the journey is where do I want to be, where do we want to position this? Because again, if I look at my value model, the performance support you can do from a number of areas, but operational excellence is really different than learning and development. And we have a lot of excellence organizations in I don't know if you, quality organizations or VP excellence, we have a number of those organizations, and I don't want to lose the connection with them because it's also important about, they have a lot of business drive to become excellence in what they do. So, and this is a bit of a complicated model, but let me just quickly walk you through. This is what we call in Shell our organizational capability model. And again, this is if you look at the story, it basically talks about you have to define your context. What are you working in? What is the area you're working in? I did a session yesterday around creating scenarios, and we use a lot of scenario thinking and a lot of other tools and techniques to think about the context you're in. Then we work on the direction. What's your vision, your mission? It's almost like the pyramid I showed on my storyline. And then we talk about what we mean by an organizational capability. Any consultant you talk to will have a model and a way of categorizing this. This just happens to be the model we use. But it talks about 5 elements. It talks about structure, and that can be anything like organizational structures, all those kind of things. We talk about people, processes, culture, and leadership. Those are the 5 buckets we tend to use. And again, you can use other groupings, whatever is relevant for you. But ultimately, you need to make this work in order to drive business results. And if I say that, I want to see KM as an organizational capability, and we actually think KM has elements of all of these, because it needs the type of leadership. It needs to have skills in people to start working differently. You require a sort of culture that comes with it. We need some structures that also are in place in terms of structures we need to make this, to run this show. We need processes. So we thought being a part of the organization development and learning organization might be the right organization, because that organization looks after, is this in place? And in the organization development and learning area, we focus on looking at 4 levels of capability. We talk about the individual level. That's typically individual competences. And that's what, if you talk to your learning people, they might talk about competences and how do I build individual competences. We do quite a bit of work on team effectiveness and how do you drive team effectiveness. My focus is very much on communities, which is about your question about where in the organization. We go across the organization, because that's where most of the communities add value, because they connect people that probably don't normally work together. And then you have people on the organization, and these are the people for us that do organization designs, big transformations, and all that kind of stuff. So that's why we are now part of the organization development and learning organization. And that, for me, should become a multiplier. Currently, I have a team of about 30 people, where we try and do the programmatic implementation. In Learning and Shell, we have between 400 and 500 people, all the way from organization development consultants to learning staff to whatever. So for me, it's also finding a multiplier there. We're looking for other multipliers as well. Where can I find the hooks? We are doing some work with internal communication, because about the digital employee experience, which is around how do you bring all the things that the employee touched and how do you bring that together? We're trying to link with the broader HR processes, onboarding, offboarding, talent, and see where you can find the hooks there as well. Because we think ultimately KM, in our mind, should be part of the way we work. And I think that's as much as I had prepared. So I'm very happy to take any questions.
So what I heard you say was that you align yourself with the operational functions or the way things are going, right? You try to work with what is in order to add value instead of trying to change anything.
No.
Or I think the question I was trying to ask is that, so do you sit at the strategic level that helps drive where everything's going already? Or are you waiting for that action to take and then you adopt?
It's probably a bit of both, because I find I can be very aspirational on what I can achieve with KM. But I find in most of the change journeys, more is required than just KM. So if I want to drive an operational excellence journey, it requires leadership, it requires lean, it requires, I don't know how many other ways of working thinking. I find is if I tie KM to it, I can accelerate it, I can make it faster, and I can make it more impactful. So I'm trying to look for the hooks in the business, the big change journeys. Because if I need to change a big change journey in my company, it's difficult to do that from my purely KM perspective. But if I can multiply by tying myself to something, accelerate it, and make it longer. Because you see a lot of change journeys take a couple of months, a year, and then they're done because people think we've done. But then we want to leave something behind. And if we've left the infrastructure, the communities, the ways of working, etc. behind, then it will propel itself. Yeah, good. So communities is an integral part, because most of the times we build communities. We have probably a range of, like anybody could see, from haphazard, sort of self-organized communities. We have a community of Mac users in Shell, and that's self-organized, they started, etc. We just provide a platform. That's on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, we have highly structured communities with moderators, which are structured, with experts in there, and those are the really highly organized communities, and we probably have a range of those. And we try and identify, based on the use case, what is the problem we're trying to solve, what communities would be best fit for that. And then we support them by setting them up, training the moderators, make sure you launch them, the first conversations that take place, you set the tone in the conversation, etc. So there's very practical things of setting that up, and we support our businesses in doing that. But we're trying to make it impactful, because a lot of times people come to you saying, can I have a community? And that's the starting point of a leader, because they've heard something or they thought, hey, that's cool, or let me give it. And then you need to say, do a diagnostic of this. Okay, I understand the community, but who's the audience you want to connect? Oh, I want to connect my salespeople. Okay, but why do you want to connect your salespeople, and why do you think they would be interested in connecting? Well, I want to get them to do more upselling. Why do you want them to do more upselling? Well, because, and then you start exploring the conversation, and then you actually get to the point where the initial request of I want a community might not be the right one. So for me, it's really about that diagnostic conversation to get to what's the real problem they're trying to solve. But don't start to say, what's your business case? Because that puts them off. You have to take them on the questions. So you start with the community, you start with the audience. That's at least the skill I found. So if you do that, you get into a much richer conversation than saying, you want a community? Okay, here's the form. What's the business case? Other questions? Yep. Yeah, so we had completely separate organizations. So we had KM, knowledge management, we had organization development, we had learning. And we found that they were all working in silos. And they were always, someone from learning, when there was a problem, always saw a learning problem. And someone from KM saw KM problems. And typically it's like, so you have the tools you have, so that's why the glasses you look at the problems. And we saw that was not optimal, because a lot of them were sort of doing things in parallel, duplicating, etc. So we thought we really need to get to what the root cause problems are, and then really focus on those and collaborate much more. And that's what we see with organization development. People are saying, with leaders, the organization's not working. Well, why is it not working? Are people not collaborating? Well, that might be care, might be part of the solution. So we try and get to a point where some of our leaders are much more know the scope of the type of capability things we can cover. So that was really the benefit of trying to do that. But we're still trying to learn how to do that. It's only half a year old, that model. But we think that's the model to go forward.
I think that was our last question.
Okay.
Please join me in thanking Willem for his presentation.